Hey, as you can see from my giant beard, random Ethernet cable, and whiteboard, I'm a senior developer, and I wanted to talk about where I see problems with senior engineering roles. So, most times when we start out as a graduate or an intern, we think, hey, I just need 7 years experience or 5 years experience and I can apply for this senior developer role. And wouldn't it be great if I could earn that much money and have all this authority and feel like I can, kind of have some expertise in this industry? But the issue is that we can't really see the path ahead of us when we start out. And so, if I worked on the same WordPress website for 5 years, would I be a senior developer? I'd have 5 years' experience. I might even be called a senior developer by my team. But I wouldn't have the skills or understanding that that title implies. So, what is a senior engineer? I think there are three core things that define a senior engineer. It's someone who can solve problems that they create, doesn't need a lot of oversight, and can investigate something outside their area of expertise relatively well. My hypothesis here is that a new graduate isn't actually going to learn to do all of those things because they're not going to understand a lot of the fundamentals of what web development is. So let's start with a bit about my own career. I've got about 12 years of experience. I started out in PHP. I got a job doing TCL of all things. And then I slowly became a front end developer and moved through different tech stacks. So I've worked with teams who use C Sharp.net. I've personally used Perl, Python, Node.js, Rails. I tend to stick to smaller companies because I feel like I can make an impact. But that also comes with the downside of, hey, we have this legacy project that's been here for 20 years. Can you update it? Right now, I'm a senior engineer at a late stage startup, so I would call it, that uses Rails and React. I'm not an architectural person. I don't have massive API chops. I'm not a lead code expert. I don't contribute to open source projects. I just solve simple problems. I do it quickly, and I avoid overcomplicating things. I tend to wear a product hat quite a bit, and I tend to write most of our company's CSS because everyone hates CSS. There's a couple of core moments that I want to share that kind of helped shape me into a senior engineer. So I started an internship in 2012, and I'd been working on local business websites with a WYSIWYG editor for about 2 years at that point. But this internship was sort of my first development role. It barely paid for the trip to and from the office every day, but I did have an experienced mentor, and that really helped me out. This guy's name was Fergal, and he was much more experienced even than I am now at the time. I'm not calling him old, but he was kind of old. One of the first things he said to me was, I'm going to act as if I'm paying you €500 a day in the hopes that one day you'll be worth that amount of money. And to me, that was unimaginable. Like I had never earned anywhere near that amount of money. And so I was really eager to please and to learn. The job itself was simple enough. I would just comb through old legacy PHP code that was written by interns, and I would identify potential security issues. Then I would put a comment on them, commit to Git, and Fergal would come along and actually fix the issue. So for the first 6 months, let's say, I didn't write any code. I just commented PHP, variable injection, extrapolating post into variables directly, or something ridiculous like that. And he would come and fix it. One day he came to me and said, hey, we need a proper CI pipeline. Could you set up Hudson on this machine? Now, Hudson, if you're unfamiliar, is the precursor to Jenkins, which is a CI server that people used before cloud services like Circle CI were kind of the standard. I spent weeks trying to get Hudson running. It's gone through all sorts of build issues, Windows Server issues, JVM, incompatibilities. It was a nightmare. I went through, I can't remember if it was Grunt or Ant, whichever one of those, a lot of build files. And after about 2 to 3 months, I had the project up and running. Hudson would run, I could run a test suite, it would pass, and I was kind of happy with it. There were still a few front end issues with stuff loading and all this kind of stuff, but I'm slowly working through it. So one day during a smoke break, Fergal asked me how it was going with Hudson. I said, hey, I've got it up and running actually if you want to have a look. So he followed me back to my desk and I ran the test build. And the test build spun up, it sat there for a few moments, logged some variables, and then said complete. So I was happy. You can probably guess what he asked next. How do we get it to build our code? At this point, I felt like I was defeated because I didn't even understand what a CI pipeline was beyond a theoretical explanation in college. I had no idea this was meant to build our code. I just knew Hudson had to exist and that, this server was the thing I was banging my head against for the last 2 months. So there was an obvious lesson there, which was when in doubt, ask. And that's what he was trying to teach me. So in 2015 then, I ended up working for a larger company whose product was video-based. I was handed a design for a new page, and it was a PDF, which should have been my first red flag. And the designer had created a mosaic spiral pattern. So you would have a few videos in the center, and then other videos dotted around in this sort of spiral pattern. And yeah, they sort of fit into boxes, but you'd have larger and smaller boxes essentially. They had this mosaic layout, and then they wanted a different version on tablet and a different version on mobile that would responsively adapt and change the shape, but that certain videos would end up in certain spots because they wanted to highlight certain videos. One additional requirement was that when you hovered over a video, it would start playing immediately. Initially, I pushed back on this because it seemed impossible at the time, but the old head of product had become the CEO, and so the product team was in a place of power and said, this is the design, it's not changing. We also required backward compatibility with IE7, so CSS Grid wasn't an option. It was quite new at the time anyway, so we hadn't used it before. And so I built the most tortured piece of HTML that has ever existed. It was full of classes to hide this element on mobile, hide that element, show this element, restructure this, increase the size of this element, and it would all have to adapt as you close the browser. And if you actually tried it would contort and explode in different directions as you move the browser. One of the other issues was that our local environments only had 3 or 4 videos loaded because we only needed 3 or 4 videos to test most pages. So in my development environment, when I was working on this, it would load these 3 or 4 videos and they would just duplicate across the page a bunch of times. I didn't really see this as a problem, but when I put it on the staging server, it became a problem because the browser would cache the data in these videos, and so it wouldn't need to load them into RAM multiple times. However, on the QA server, we had all the videos, and so they logged a bug. This page crashed Internet Explorer. I tried to explain that Internet Explorer didn't support the preload meta tag, so you could either load the full video or nothing and have a black box on the page. And I also explained that IE was 32-bit. They pushed back and said, no, we want this to be the case. It has to be possible. And so I sent them back a GIF with the task manager and the page, the RAM reaching 2.4 gigabytes, and the page crashing. One of the other engineers came up with a hack where he would load the thumbnail, and then when they hovered the video, he would destroy that element from the DOM and load the video on top of it, and the video would start playing. This got it past QA, but as I pointed out to him at the time, if you moved your mouse across the page and you happened to hit more than 3 videos, your browser would drop to 2 FPS for about 5 seconds and then crash. Still, it got the job done as far as the spec went, so we just let it be. One of my later jobs was at an ISP, and it involved a lot of internal tools for managing network equipment and data center equipment. These tools would use SNMP, which is Simple Network Management Protocol, and that could contact the device and request uptime information, round trip time, all these kind of details, what was on each interface. This software we were building would manage routers, switches, power distribution units, VPNs, and all of the code was based on some very old tech. So all I had was the documentation and some old Usenet group discussions, which were archived through Google Groups. A particular part of the software is meant to manage point-to-site VPNs, and they would need to check uptime and round-trip time on both sides of the line. So after I looked through the APIs and all this kind of stuff, figured out how to build it, I decided, okay, we have this connection here, we need to check round-trip time, so let's use ping. That seems obvious enough, but what I realized later was that these are layer 2 VPNs, so they're an Ethernet connection. They're on the same internal network. There are no IP addresses. You can't ping an object that doesn't have an IP address. It has a MAC address instead. And so this was something I built out that just straight up didn't work. Since this happened, I have done a certification in networking, and yeah, the problem seems kind of obvious, but I had to sit through a network engineer talking to me like I was a 7-year-old for about an hour. So that was a learning moment. I sort of said, hey, look, I know HTTP, I know TCP. Maybe I should learn OSI fully. So why do I relate these experiences? Well, it's mostly because they don't occur naturally in the course of a modern web development job. I learned JavaScript from lynda.com when I was 20, and then I was using raw XML HTTP requests in my internship. And Fergal was like, don't do that because that will drive you insane. Use jQuery instead. And then I experienced all the framework madness of the 2010s with Mithril.js, Knockout.js, whatever else you have. I became a Vanilla.js guy when ES6 came out and they brought out Filter and Map and all this REST and spread stuff. It was great. And now I use React because it's easy for our company to find React developers. But I still have all that experience of JavaScript in the past and everything that was in that at the time, which is what a lot of them are lacking. And so when something goes wrong on a network level or on a very low level with, initial state of a React component doesn't reflect some value and so the thing just fails to load completely, I can look at that and go, oh, hey, this is why that's failing. So they turn to me when they have a problem like that. That's grand, but because they're missing that experience of the lower level stuff, they might never develop that. And so let's imagine this was another field like plumbing. Imagine that every piece of piping in your home was preset, all set up through this framework, and all the plumber had to do was take a boiler and plug it into a socket on your wall. Great, that's really easy for them to do. Same as using React. Hey, look, it solves all these problems. But imagine that they did that for 10 years and they became a senior plumber. I assume that's a role. And they talked at plumbing conferences and they wrote Medium articles about how this particular how this particular boiler is plugged in and, oh, the socket's different, you have to plug it in this way. They're not learning anything about plumbing, and as soon as a pipe bursts, they're going to have to find someone with more experience. And this is what React does to developers. Similar frameworks also do it, but I think React is probably the biggest culprit. You essentially become not a front-end developer, but a React developer. And it's not your fault either. You've just done your job. The incentive structures for this are broken because we're looking at years in the industry and we're saying, oh, that's a predicate for skill. But really, at some point, it stops being that. So I think newer developers are going to have to find ways to learn these things on their own time. I mean, we already see open source contributions be a huge thing, even back when I was trying to find jobs. I've never had to do that because I learned a lot of the fundamentals through the fact that the tools I used were probably broken. I see a lot of engineers talk about how to build Docker images when they don't know how to use grep or any kind of Linux command. I see them propose microservices in like a Kubernetes cluster, and they don't know what a switch is compared to a router. We stopped learning all the fundamentals, and then we're building on top of that, but it's essentially a house of cards. So, what do I suggest for someone who wants to be a senior developer? I would say to experiment. Try things and fail horribly. A friend and I built a small game development framework on top of XNA when we were in college, and it was a slow, buggy mess, but we learned from it. I spent years trying to find a job that used React or Angular, and I learned a lot of other things along the way because I had to go through, hey, this company will hire me, that company won't. And so that's where all the knockout and whatever else stuff came from. They're not things I use now, but they gave me some understanding or experience around how things can be structured. So here's some basic ideas. Learn how HTTP works, because that's really important when something goes wrong. What are the verbs? What are the headers? What are the response codes? Learn SQL so that when your ORM starts to fail, you can say, oh, hey, it's outputting the wrong SQL. It should output this. It's not outputting that. How do we get it to do that? Build a basic app just using HTML and JavaScript. Don't use a framework. Just go, hey, I'm going to use a callback-based approach to this. Or even, God forbid, I'm going to use a prototype-based approach to this. Just try other things. If you're a Tailwind user, build something beautiful and do it using regular CSS. Learn how networking works. Learn the OSI stack. I had an experience with the PlayStation 5 recently where my ISP uses 1492 instead of 1500 as their MTU, and so packets are getting fragmented. And I was able to figure it out because I was like, okay, I can send, but I can't receive data. So, hey, MTU turned out to be the issue. But if I didn't do the networking certification, I wouldn't have had any idea that that was the case. Really try to get to grips with the fundamentals of how the web works and how databases work, all this kind of stuff. I can't lay out the exact path for you because the path I walked is now closed. You can't go and work at the shitty startups I worked at and learn these problems through working with terrible tools. I can only wish you the best and hope that you find your own way. I would end this by echoing my own mentor and say, act as if you're earning 500 a day or whatever the number is, in the hopes that one day you will. Have a good one.